Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be going through the life of one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century, Joseph Zawinul. And I will be going through his life in 10 albums. So I've picked out 10 albums that I think are a reasonable representation of Zawinul's incredible career within jazz. I'm not saying these are his 10 greatest albums, they're the albums that I love, and in some cases there are other albums you could get as well, but if you want to get 10 albums to sort of give yourself an overview of Zawinul's career, then these 10 albums would be a good place to start. And it allows me to take you on a journey through the career of really one of the greatest jazz musicians of the 20th century, and a musician I think that has been underrated for his achievements within jazz. Joe Zawinul is most well known for being the founder member and keyboardist of Weather Report along with Wayne Shorter. Weather Report lasted for around about 15 years, I would say. Zawinul's career at the front line of jazz is probably 40 years, so there's a whole ton of other stuff there, but I will be discussing Weather Report as well on this video, because you cannot extricate Zawinul from Weather Report and the achievements of Weather Report as one of the greatest jazz fusion bands of all time. Now, Zawinul was a little bit older than many of the musicians that created jazz fusion. He was actually born in 1932, and he grew up in Vienna, Austria. Of course, being born in 1932 in Vienna means he is one of those rare jazz musicians that grew up under Nazi occupation or lived under Nazi occupation. Another very important jazz musician that also lived under Nazi occupation was, of course, Django Reinhardt, which I find quite interesting, because Django Reinhardt brings into jazz the idea and concept of gypsy, the traveller, right? And I feel that Zawinul brings in something very similar into jazz. He brings in a sort of Eastern European folk music aspect, and he seems to be able to see the way that combines with other folk forms, especially African folk forms, South American folk forms, and of course European folk forms. This is his really great input into jazz, and I wonder whether the success of Zawinul and Django within the jazz realm is because they themselves had the feeling of outsiderness, that's probably a better way to describe it, which fueled the great, black American jazz musicians. We may touch on that later in the video. So he's growing up in Vienna, 1932. When the war starts in 1939, he would have been 7. Austria was occupied by that time. He started playing the accordion. And the accordion's a very interesting instrument. Of course, the accordion is so important in the history of music. Before the accordion came along, music was much more local, right? And if you went to one part of the world, you might find their tuning system, their C would have been slightly different to everybody else's C. Once the accordion was made and mass produced, it's one of the first instruments that you don't tune, it's set. And that creates a sort of worldwide approach to harmony. The other thing that's interesting about the accordion is it's movable. It's not like a piano, so it's very applicable to folk forms, to carnivals, to markets, to festivals, all those types of things. A musician can turn up. I can remember when I was working on a show at Kidderminster College, one of the lecturers, the great Murphy McCaleb, who's a fantastic trombone player and pianist, we created a sort of European folk group with a clarinet and Murphy playing the accordion. And the wonderful thing about this group is when they rehearsed, they were stood up and they could walk around. And so, as they were rehearsing the material, I remember one day they went like, let's go for a walk. And they walked off around the town, playing as they walked, right? The idea of the procession, the idea of being in the community, right? The idea of the keyboards encompassing sort of modern technology, which is what the accordion did, at the same time being able to be taken out into the world, and unlike the piano, being based upon the idea of breath. Okay? Because Zawinul not only studied the accordion growing up, he studied like clarinet, he studied violin. Of course, the breath in the accordion isn't coming from you, it's coming from the mechanics of pulling the bellows in and out. The aspect of breath is so important to so many folk forms of music. It's an interesting idea. And also the idea of synthesis. When Zawinul was a kid, growing up in the 30s and 40s, he would put pieces of cloth inside his accordion to try and affect the sound. Right? So that accordion, that sound, seems to me to be so important of the development of Zawinul as a musician. But of course, Zawinul was also an incredibly talented pianist. He ends up going to the Vienna Conservatoire, and many people who studied with him have said that he could have easily have gone on into a career as a classical pianist. His technique was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Now, I say this because as we go into his career, it is not quite as apparent how virtuoso Zawinul was as a musician. And the reason for this is because I think his compositions and his approach to music was so high that with really great musicians, their technique and virtuosity disappears. And I think this is the case with Zawinul. So he eventually gets out of Austria in the early 50s after the war. And of course, it's worth mentioning that throughout the war, he was living in pretty dire circumstances. You know, when I read his biography, you know, it was apparent that, you know, he would go out and hunt rats, you know, that he can remember being involved in, I think, a bombing, and then, you know, there was an explosion and one of his friends ended up under the rubble, and he tells a story of pulling the leg and just the leg coming off. Really horrific circumstances that Zawinul grew up with. And I think with Zawinul, this created a toughness very similar to Miles Davis in a way. So in the 50s, he gets a scholarship to Berkeley. He goes over to Berkeley. He's an incredible player at that point, and straight away he gets picked up by Maynard Ferguson. As soon as he arrives in the States, he's grabbed by the great and the good of the jazz scene at that time. He does some sessions with Dinah Washington, and then he ends up in one of the most incredible jazz groups of the late 50s, early 60s, and this is the Cannonball Adderley quintet. In that band, he submits a number of compositions. There's one called Walk Tall, there's one called Country Preacher, and most famous, he writes the jazz standard Mercy Mercy. So that's not bad. Before we get to the stuff he's famous for, that's pretty incredible. By the 60s, he has established himself as a top-line jazz musician. Cannonball Adderley had an all-black band, right? He didn't need to employ some white guy from Austria, right? The reason why he got the gig is because Zawinul was able to play at that level, okay? Now, the album I'm going to pull out by Cannonball Adderley is the album that I have, that I grew up with. The best album to probably get is Country Preacher, which is a live album. It's the one with Jesse Jackson on. But the one I've got that I bought when I was young was this, because I love the cover. And that's the album that I grew up with by the Cannonball Adderley Quintet, Nippon Soul, which was recorded in Tokyo. The lineup is obviously Cannonball Adderley on alto sax, Nat Adderley on cornet, Yosef Lateef on flute, oboe and tenor sax, Zawinul on piano, Sam Jones on bass, and Louis Hayes, the great Louis Hayes, on drums. And this is the album I brought up. There's actually no Zawinul compositions on here. There's a couple of jazz standards, things like Easy to Love and Come Sunday with Duke Ellington. There's a couple of Yosef Lateef compositions on here. But this is the album I brought up with, and I just love that cover, and of course they play incredibly. So if you want to hear Zawinul in a more jazz setting and really hear what a virtuoso jazz musician he was, then go and check out this album or any of the Cannonball Adderley albums from that time. So that's the first album I've got on the list. Zawinul seems to have been way past everybody else, right? I don't know if this was a little bit older, and the fact that he'd had experience playing jazz in Vienna. So when he arrives in America, he's in his 20s. By the time he's playing with Cannonball Adderley in 1962, for example, he would have been 30 years old. His ideas are developed. He has a vision for music, and it is a fusion of music, right? Now, he gets spotted by Miles Davis, and he gets brought into the Miles Davis world. He's not actually a band member, but he contributes to this album in a silent way. My God, does he contribute to this? Now, of course, this is, after Kind of Blue, the next most groundbreaking album that Miles Davis ever made, right? And so many people say this is where jazz rock, jazz fusion begins. I don't think it does. What emerges here is another sound, and I believe that sound comes from Zawinul. Obviously, that he's on this album alongside Herbie Hancock. You know, he's playing electric piano and organ on here, but he also submits a composition in a silent way. I really believe that twilight sound, right, which is going to be so important for Zawinul moving forward, emerges on this album. Miles Davis allows it to come out. You know, and the incredible thing is John McLaughlin also emerges at this point. So there's a link between these two mighty forces. And of course we have the great Wayne Shorter on here. I always forget to talk about Wayne Shorter. People think I don't like Wayne Shorter or I'm ignoring him. No, Wayne Shorter is one of the greatest musicians as well. This is another, possibly the greatest jazz composer of the 1960s was Wayne Shorter. Wayne Shorter's already, you know, set the standard in the second great quintet with Miles Davis. These are the greatest musicians. But on this album, Shorter and Zawinul coming together, there's an incredible magic there. There's an improvisational magic that emerges. All right, they are at one with each other, and when they improvise with each other, they don't necessarily have to solo. They don't have to use the structures created by jazz. They actually go back to something which is much more based upon early jazz. It's an idea of group improvisation, but in Zawinul's case, within very tightly controlled compositional structures. And I say about Wayne Shorter because Wayne Shorter is creating similar compositions. So here we have the genesis, really, of the two great forces that are going to form jazz rock. The one is the sort of post-Miles Davis world that is explored by Zawinul and Shorter in Weather Report, and of course, you know, John McLaughlin in the Malvish Orchestra. And I hope you appreciate now I've decided to go for the Glocklin. I've been practicing, so I've got that down. It was either that or I just called him John, which I didn't think was a good idea. So anyway, one of the greatest albums in jazz history, and of course Zawinul's there. The third album I've got is Bitches Brew. I have the Bitches Brew box set here with all the recordings on. He also submits compositions. He submits the compositions Pharaoh's Dance. Zawinul is in control on these albums. You know, I always feel that he's not acting as a sideman, and he was not part of the band. Neither John McLaughlin or Zawinul were part of this group. This group at the time was like Chick Corea, Dave Holland, Jack DeJohnette. Was it Dave Liebman after that, or Steve Grossman? I can't remember. I think it was Dave Liebman. Not too sure. Oh, you see, I've gone into an area I don't know about. I'm pretty sure it's Steve Grossman. Steve Grossman on Jack Johnson, isn't it? Anyway, I'm off on a tangent here. Sure, you'll tell me in the comments. This, of course, is another groundbreaking album. When I came across Bitches Brew as a young, you know, music fan, it bemused me immensely. I didn't get it at all, and I had to really study it and listen to it. The track Miles Runs the Voodoo Down and Spanish Key, those are the tracks I got first. The hardest one for me to get my head round was Pharaoh's Dance, the opener, which was a Zawinul composition. Once I started to understand it, that became my favourite track. And what's really interesting is the tracks In a Silent Way and the track Pharaoh's Dance. Miles is taking those compositions and almost like pulling them apart. Okay, Zawinul's compositional senses are there. What we have is this flavour, and this flavour is pure fusion. He's bringing in all these elements from himself. You know, he's bringing in the elements of sort of European folk music, the classical music, which of course is deeply embedded in Austrian, culture. He's bringing in also aspects from Africa. All these things are coming together. It's true fusion. After making those albums, he forms the band Weather Report. Weather Report is formed as almost like a super group. Bitches Brewers sold a ton of records. The record companies can't work out why. They don't understand that all the hippies are taking acid and listening to Bitches Brew, and it's like the wildest thing, way past the Grateful Dead. It's this insane, experience of these half-hour-long tracks. People are getting lost in that world, so they start to sign up these bands. Weather Report is put together as a super group, with Wayne Shorter, obviously. That team is put together. But for me, the album that I'm going to put forward for that early period is going to be this one, which I think is an absolute masterpiece. It's I think Zawinul's fourth solo album. He did make solo albums throughout the 60s, and I think there's an album called Birth of the Third Stream. That's probably the other one to get, but none of them are in this lead. This is an absolute masterpiece. It's stronger than the early Weather Report albums for me. The lineup is absolutely incredible. There's Joe Zawinul and Herbie Hancock on electric pianos. There's George Davis on flute, Woody Shaw on trumpet, Earl Turbington on soprano sax. We've got Miroslav Vitous, who would also be a founder member of Weather Report, and Walter Booker on bass, who I believe was also the bass player for a time in the Cannonball Adderley group. And on drums he's got Joe Chambers, Billy Hart and David Lee. It was also, we get on this Hubert Laws crops up on a couple of the tracks. Jack DeJohnette also crops up, not only playing drums but also playing melodica. This is an absolute masterpiece of an album. And I think the reason why it's so important, because on the second track on side 2 is In a Silent Way. And In a Silent Way, obviously this is Zawinul's version of It on a Silent Way, and there's notes on this album, and the notes that go with that track is impression of Joe Zawinul's days as a shepherd boy in Austria. There's also a track called His Last Journey, which is a tone poem reminiscent of his grandfather's funeral in the cold winter day of an Austrian mountain village. This is true fusion, and this is a masterpiece album. It really is. If I was going to pick the Weather Report albums, I have real problems. I didn't just want to fill this up with Weather Report albums, but they are so incredible. I think that Zawinul album has the edge over the first Weather Report album. Now, some people think that that's an absolute masterpiece. For me, it's a little bit directionless and a little bit. They haven't quite nailed this, always soloing and never soloing concept for me. There's incredible compositions on there. I think it's Zawinul and Shorter's vision is being pulled in by the other incredible musicians on there. It's a band. It's too democratic. Once Zawinul really gets control, and I always felt that Weather Report was Zawinul's band. Shorter played a part, a very important part, but not the way that Zawinul. It was Zawinul's vision. I think the second album is the one, if you want to really get into early Weather Report and hear what that sounded like before they started to go more commercial, for me the great album of that period is I Sing the Body Electric. And I think on the track Unknown Soldier, you start to hear this incredible compositional approach. You could tell that Zawinul is a huge fan of Duke Ellington, right? And he wants to create the sound of a big band. This is the guy that came to America, and his first gig was with Maynard Ferguson. And he wants to use keyboards and synthesis to create the sound of a sort of the orchestral aspect of the jazz big band, right back to Duke Ellington. And there's a compositional sense on Unknown Soldier, which is quite incredible. On side 2, we get the live stuff, Vertical Invader. We get a version of Dr. Honoris Causa, which is also on his first album. Directions, which is another track that Miles Davis used to play. And we hear Weather Report at that time live. And if you really want to check out that, you go and get Live in Tokyo, which was released many years later. These tracks here come from the gig that Live in Tokyo came from. And you hear the brutal power, which you do not hear on the first album. All right, so that's the album I'm going to put through. I've got 3 Weather Report albums to offer you in this list. And I'm just going to get my list up. Oh no, I just switched my list off. You fool! Now I've got to find it again. I don't want to go off on a tangent. This is where I would be if I was a proper YouTuber. I'd edit this bit out. But you know me, I keep going, all costs. So where are we up to? Icing the Body Electric. So, Weather Report starts to advance, and many people, I think the sort of elitist, arty-farty, snotty-nosed jazz cognoscenti, they prefer the really early albums because they're more avant-garde, they're more exploratory. But Zawinul's got a vision, and he's refining that down. And it's as though all music is pouring into Weather Report. That's why they got the name, because they're always changing. This is why the weather's always changing. And they start to bring in, soul and funk influences. They emerge on Sweet Nighter, which is also a masterpiece. And I thought, shall I put Sweet Nighter in there? Then they take those ideas and they condense them even more. And I feel you get the first really masterpiece Weather Report album, which is Mysterious Traveller. And I'm not even going to put that in. This is how good Zawinul is. Mysterious Traveller is a masterpiece. Tail Spinning, which followed on from that, is a masterpiece. But the next album I'm going to put forward is going to be Black Market. Now, I own that on CD now. I've lost my vinyl copy. I think Black Market is Weather Report's greatest album. It's where all the elements come together. It still has a foot in that early exploratory, fiery stuff that they were doing early on. And it points to the future. You've got Jaco Pastorius appearing on that album. And of course, we have the mighty Narada Michael Walden on 2 tracks. I love Narada Michael Walden. There is a spirit to his drumming, which very few drummers have. And I feel on the track Black Market, everything comes together. With Narada's drums, there's, Wayne Shorter's incredible saxophone solo, all the multi-layered synths emulating that sort of big band sound. That for me is where Weather Report's at its peak. They push this idea further out, and what you start to see is those folk influences and the idea of sort of creating this technologically highly refined, sophisticated carnival music. This starts to emerge. When you look at the cover of Black Market, you can see what Weather Report sounds like, and that is pushed even further onto the next masterpiece, which of course is this, which is also one of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time. Zawinul is a guy born in the early 1930s. Right, he's come through the experience. He's grown up through the war. He comes to America. He's an outsider. He's a European, and he comes to America. He takes jazz. He completely redefines it over and over again. And he takes what he has defined and he pulls it down into a thing which is accessible to millions of people. This album has sold millions of copies, and it created their first hit, Birdland. Now, Birdland is an incredibly sophisticated composition. It integrates soloing within the composition in the same way Duke Ellington does, and it tells the story of jazz in a way. And you hear Zawinul using the synthesizers to create the feeling of a big band, that swing, but it subverts it. And a lot of the time when you listen to it, you're thinking, is this composed or is this written? There's many solos on there that you wonder. So as you take Jaco's Break, when he first comes in, and he's got those harmonics. He's going. That's the theme. But when Jacko plays it, it almost feels like a solo, you know. And as you listen, Shorter comes in and you go, "Is this a solo? Was this a part of the play?" You know. Zawinul comes in the end with an incredibly virtuoso synthesized solo. He's just blurring all over the notes. And this is where I want to talk about Zawinul's virtuosity. I once heard a recording of Zawinul warming up on a gig. And it sounded like Conlan Nancaro. It sounded like this incredible virtuoso blistering technique. I've never heard anything like it. But when he plays, he's completely subservient to the music and expressing musical ideas. At this point, Zawinul is creating his compositions by improvising, recording his improvisations, and then taking those and orchestrating those to the band. It's really fascinating approach to music. If you listen to this, it's famous because Jaco Pastorius comes in and changes the bass world on this album, on tracks like Teen Town. But if you listen to Teen Town, it's being doubled. It's being doubled by Zawinul with his left hand, right? Whilst at the same time playing other stuff. It's insane. This album, even though it's commercial, does not pull any punches, right? If you put your ears in there and really listen, this is high-end jazz improvisation, high-end composition. Conceptually, it's pushing the boundaries. This is an absolute masterpiece. How many masterpieces have we got? The Weather Report carries on. Jaco Pastorius, him being in the band not only gives them another personality. I actually think it ruins Weather Report. Jaco does in a way. This is a really contentious argument, but I think the Wayne Shorter Zawinul sort of centre of the band is then expanded. He becomes a co-producer, and the thing with Jaco, he's such a charismatic person that the band that is now having hit records and they're touring, they're like sort of rock stars. Jaco supplies the rock star end, and you watch the videos, you know, and he's doing leaps and he's sliding around on talcum powder on the stage, and you know, and he's got his great big bass solo, and I think, although that band's incredible, you know, especially when Peter Erskine comes in, I feel they flounder a little bit throughout the later albums. I don't think Mr. Gone is as strong as Heavy Weather or Black Market. The live album 830 is fantastic. We hear them really blistering. But there's when Live and Unreleased came out, and I heard the recordings earlier than that with Alex Acuna, they're even more incredible to me, to my ears. Night Passage is a fantastic album. But once Jaco and Peter Erskine go, Zawinul then, you know, brings in Omar Hakim and Victor Bailey and various percussionists, I think Jose Rossi to start off with, and reforms in the early 80s what I think is one of the great 80s fusion bands. Now, it's not hard in the 1980s to be one of the great fusion bands, because fusion sort of loses its way. You know, the record companies aren't interested. Everyone's trying to have hit records. Everyone's trying to deal with all these DX7s and drum machines, and jazz musicians don't know how to deal with it. Someone like Herbie Hancock with Rocket knows how to deal with it. Zawinul has been up there with technology all the way through, and I feel that the 80s Weather Report albums are maligned, and they shouldn't be. So I've pulled one of those out and I'm going to put it into the mix, and it is this one, Procession. This is the first album they did. If I pull the thing out, you can see Zawinul and Shorter with a little joke. They got this new band of young virtuoso musicians. They've got them in this box, right? This is a statement, you know, that, oh, you may want to see the Jaco band, but we've got these new players. You know, you can see this sort of, it's a little cartoon, and they've got this box, and then they open it, and there's these little jazz virtuosos inside, and they pull them out. It's quite comic, I think that is. This album also has Manhattan Transfer on. Okay. Manhattan Transfer also did an incredible version of Birdland, and it must have come to the attention of Zawinul. And Zawinul brings them in on this album, and they do a track called Where the Moon Goes. I absolutely love that track. I think for some Weather Report fans, they can't take it. The album that follows this, Tail Spinning, then brings Bobby McFerrin in. This is the point where Zawinul really starts to explore the voice, the human voice, and I think he always wants to talk. You feel that a lot of what he's doing is trying to talk. He's trying to create a universal language. He's trying to bring people together, and I think that's what jazz does. Even on the album behind me, which I haven't picked, Domino Theory, that opens up with a song. You know, with the great Carl Anderson sings the opening song on that album. Domino Theory, Tail Spinning, this one, Procession, they're all incredible albums, and you see the refinement of Zawinul's vision as he goes through this sort of musical traveller, vocal approach. When Weather Report dissolves, actually it might have been just before Weather Report dissolves, he does an album called Dialects, which really explores the voice. And we then get into the Zawinul Syndicate era, which I think is absolutely incredible as well. And the Zawinul Syndicate, that band lasted all the way up until his death in 2007, I think. The album I'm going to pull out is this one. It's Blackwater. This is the second album by the Zawinul Syndicate, and the reason I pull it out is because it has the incredible Scott Henderson. Scott Henderson, I felt, had a rapport with Zawinul that was absolutely incredible. He has a similar compositional approach, a similar approach to playing, but Scott Henderson brings the rock and roll in as well. There's some incredible solos on here. We have spoken word on here, and this is a really great album. You know that in 1989 there wasn't that many great jazz fusion albums. Zawinul sounds fresh. There's a little bit of sort of 80s drum programming on here, but that's a fantastic album. So that was the 9th album. So the last album I'm going to put in, I'm now going to jump over. Oops. I'm not going to literally jump over. I need to kick the camera over then. I'm now going to jump over. He creates a symphony, orchestral pieces, does all sorts of. I was ignoring all that because I couldn't fit it in my 10. Because the last album I wanted to include, which I don't own a copy of, which is an absolutely incredible album, is called 75. It comes from 2 concerts by the last incarnation of the Zawinul Syndicate. Most of it comes from a concert in Switzerland, but there is a recording right near the end of him reuniting with Wayne Shorter. The album 75 seems to be the great summation of Zawinul's career. It's an incredible album. It really is an incredible album. The playing on there is incredible. All the things I've been talking about on this video seem to come together on that album. He does Weather Report tunes, he does Zawinul Syndicate tunes, and at the end of the album, and it's so... Zawinul is on fire. This guy, who is pretty close to, the end of his life, still sounds completely energised. Zawinul, I think, died of skin cancer, so it might have been quite a quick thing with Zawinul. There's moments, this is another point I want to make about Joe Zawinul. I've said on this channel over and over again that the great architect of jazz rock, jazz fusion was John McLaughlin with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. That is definitely the case. Weather Report take time to get going. They hit their height around about 1976-77. The Mahavishnu Orchestra has made its mark by 1971. But I will say that Zawinul's compositional approach wins out. By the time you get to the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, so many more fusion bands are pulling from Zawinul's approach. Even John McLaughlin. I hear the influence of Weather Report and Joe Zawinul's compositional approach on McLaughlin's album. And I'm going to be brave enough to say that because on Adventures in Radioland there's actually a track called Josie, which is a tribute to Joe Zawinul. So this compositional approach, I feel on the album 75, which is also sometimes called 75th, it really consolidates all the different things. There's the vocals, there's African music, there's a sort of folk music, this carnival sound, the synthesizing stuff. Everything is on that album. It's a really incredible album. They do a version of Fast City by Weather Report. They also do a version of Scarlet Woman by Weather Report, and both of those are better than the original version. Sorry, I have to say it, this is what I think. Fast City has a guitar solo which takes Zawinul right at the end of his life almost into the Mavish Orchestra territory. It's blistering. The second to last track is Wayne Shorter and Zawinul playing In a Silent Way. It seems to bring his whole career full circle. And then the last track on the album is a Zawinul tune called Him. It is so apt. A few years later, Zawinul was gone. Wayne Shorter carried on. You know, Wayne Shorter lived to, what was it? Was he 90 years old? Nearly 90 years old when he died, you know, only a few months ago in reality. They are two of the great musicians. I felt I needed to really state that on this channel so people see how much I love this. I have all the Weather Report albums plus a ton of Zawinul albums. Weather Report is one of the great, you know, bands of the jazz rock era, and Zawinul is without doubt not only one of the greatest musicians in jazz rock and jazz fusion, but he's one of the greatest jazz musicians, full stop. So, I've come to the end of this video. If you liked this video, please press the like button. If you want to see more, you can subscribe to my channel. You know, now it's not going to hurt you to press the like button, is it? So come on, just give us a like. You know, that's not going to hurt you because it helps the channel. It really does. If you want to see more, you can subscribe. If you want to support me in what I'm doing here, then you can become a patron. And there is a ton of stuff. I do a lot more stuff over on Patreon than I do here. There is a ton of video, but we have loads of meetings and chats, and you know, I've just recently been working on a track with one of the patrons, which is very interesting. I have guests that come in and chat with the patrons. It's a really incredible place. So if you really want to get involved, then you could click on the link below and have to check out my Patreon. If you're too busy to get bogged down in my world, but you still want to support me, I do have a PayPal tip jar, the link's down there, and that is really helping me at the moment. I can't tell you how much this is helping me at the moment. It really is. I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for the Patreon and the PayPal. I can't say too much about it, but I can't tell you how much I'm here because of that. I don't just mean here as in talking to you on YouTube and keep the YouTube going. I mean actually keeping me and my family going. So this is a really incredible thing. And the next video I'm about to do, I'm going to really talk about, you know, the nature of this YouTube and music YouTubes, but I'm going to do it in a fun way. So I've got to now prepare myself for that video. So anyway, I've done all the stuff. I'm at the end of the video. Joe Zawinul, genius. 10 albums by him. I hope you enjoyed that journey through his career. I hope that those of you who have all the albums were at least surprised by some of the choices. Don't go coming at me saying, why didn't you put on, you know, Mysterious Traveller, or, you know, where's you know, Country Preacher by, you know. The reason I've done this is to make it interesting for you and pull out some of the ones that are personal to me. And I do think, looking at the comments, I am going to have to do a video at some point on what I'm trying to do here and why I compare stuff, and because I'm getting a little bit fed up with people going, oh, you can't compare music, you can't compare music. I know, right, I know, but I do. Why? You know, I've dealt with that idea of the objectivity and subjectivity of music. This is what I've dealt with philosophically on this channel. So much. It's probably people just aren't getting, you know, they're not going deep enough into my world, are they? They're not going, you know, there's 500 videos here and I bet they've only watched about 30. You've got to watch at least 200 before you can really know what I'm trying to do. And then even then you won't know what you're trying to do. I've watched all of them because I'm in them all. And I still don't know what I'm doing. And if I don't know what I'm doing, there's no way you're going to know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. You don't know what I'm doing. None of us do. See you on the next video.